They believed this would make it easier for people to afford their debts. In reality, all it did was make anyone holding British sterling 14% poorer overnight. It made everything in Britain much, much more expensive in the coming years. For the country as a whole, it ushered in one of the worst decades in modern British history. Most Americans don't know anything about Britain's winter of discontent in the late 1970s when the government put a freeze on wages. There were continuous strikes in nearly every sector: grave diggers, trash collectors, even hospital workers. Things got so bad at one point that many hospitals were reduced to accepting emergency patients only. In 1975, inflation in Britain skyrocketed to 26.9% in a single year. The government also imposed what was known as the 3-day week in 1974. In short, businesses were limited to using electricity for only 3 specified consecutive days each week, and they were prohibited from working longer hours on those days. Television companies were required to cease broadcasting at 10:30 p.m. to save electricity. The extreme problems in the economy led Britain to being nicknamed the sick man of Europe. Just how bad were things exactly? We'll listen to the experiences of several Brits. Their stories were collected recently by the BBC television channel. John Blackburn from Wetherby said,
I was a control engineer at Huddersfield Power Station at the time, and part of my duty was to switch off the supply to various substations around the town according to an official rota. On many an evening shift, I would have to switch off the power to my own home before going back for a candle-lit supper.
Richard Evans from London recalls,
My mother had to cross a picket line to get into the maternity hospital. They told her she couldn't come in. My grandmother had to bring in food for her to eat and clean towels and bedding.
And David Stoker from Guildford said,
I lived in the northeast near Newcastle, and I vividly remember my grandmother and I walking from one shop to another in search of candles. All were sold out. Innovative butchers placed string down cartons of drippings which we bought. These worked, although the smell and risk of fire made them less practical than candles.
Imagine, Britain was a global superpower for 150 years, but when they started intentionally devaluing their currency, things went straight downhill. Maybe you don't think something similar can happen here, but I'm telling you, it's already underway. In fact, the exchange value of the U.S. dollar has fallen about 8% so far this year, and its rate of decline is accelerating. What happened to the British currency is now happening to the U.S. dollar. Not only will the price of gas, oil, and other commodities skyrocket in America, almost everything we consume will immediately get more expensive. All the clothing, furniture, and household goods we import from China, all the food we get from Central and South America, all the electronics, television, computers, and cars we get from Asia and Europe. In fact, it's happening right now before our eyes. The price of gold is up 85% since the start of the financial crisis. Oil prices have doubled. Soybeans are way up. Copper prices are up more than 170% since 2009. Cotton prices are up 80% in just the past few months, since July of this year. As Wesley Card, the head of a clothing company that includes brands like Dockers and Anne Klein, was recently quoted by the Epoch Times. It's really a no-choice situation, he said. Prices have to come up. This chart shows how much a few key commodities have skyrocketed in price just since the beginning of 2009. Of course, skyrocketing commodity prices are just the beginning. There are other disastrous consequences to the U.S. dollar losing status as the world's reserve currency. For example, there would be much less demand for U.S. dollars around the globe, so interest rates will skyrocket. Instead of getting a mortgage at today's incredibly low rates of 4.5%, it might cost you 8%, or even 10%, or 15%. Imagine what that would do to housing prices. Stock prices would likely plummet by at least 40% in a matter of weeks as a result of this event in the currency markets. It will cost every American business a lot more money for supplies and materials. No one will be able to get a loan, and no bank will want to make loans. In short, when the U.S. dollar loses its spot as the world's reserve currency, it will cause a brutal downturn in the economy, which I expect will be about 10 times worse than the mortgage crisis of 2008. You see, What will also happen as a result of this currency crisis and the end of the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency will be massive inflation, the likes of which we've never seen before. When everyone is trying to get rid of their dollars, the government is printing more and more to pay debts, and no one wants to own them, the crisis will reach epic proportions. Just look, for example, at what happened to one European country that faced this type of crisis in the 1990s. This is what happens during a major hyperinflation in the real world. By the early 1990s, the national government of one European nation had spent nearly all of its savings. What did they do next? Simple. They began to steal the savings of private citizens by limiting people's access to their money in government-controlled banks. To finance the daily operations of maintaining their basic infrastructure, the government started printing money big time. Even so, the country's basic infrastructure began to fall apart. There were potholes in the street, broken water pipes, elevators that never got repaired. Entire construction projects simply shut down. At this point, the unemployment rate was more than 30%. Not too bad, right? But it got worse, much worse. You see, once you start down the dangerous road of printing money, things can get extremely bad very quickly. As San Jose State University economics professor Dr. Thayer Watkins explains, the government tried to counter the inflation by imposing price controls. But when inflation continued, the government price controls made the price producers were getting so ridiculously low that they simply stopped producing. Bakers stopped making bread. Slaughterhouses refused to sell meat to the stores, and other stores closed down. So what did the government do next to try to curb inflation? Well, one bright idea they had was to force stores to fill out government documents every time they increased prices. They thought this would slow down price increases because the paperwork would take so much time. But like many government plans, this one had terrible unintended consequences. Since stores had a dedicated employee to do nothing but register the paperwork, and since the process took so long, stores began to raise prices on basic goods at even higher rates so that they didn't have to come back and file more paperwork. Incredible, isn't it? Then, of course, the government did what all governments do during periods of hyperinflation. They created a new currency, which basically removed 6 zeros from the old one. So 100 million old units were soon worth 100 new units. Of course, this didn't work either. It never does. Between October 1993 and January 1995, prices increased by, get this, 5 quadrillion%. That's a ridiculous number. In other words, a loaf of bread that cost $1 in 1993 suddenly costs $50 trillion. Yes, that's 50 trillion. I know it's laughable, but I can guarantee that the people of this once proud European country weren't laughing one bit, especially those living on a fixed income. Of course, at this point, the country completely fell apart. As Dr. Thayer Watkins wrote, quote, "The social structure began to collapse. Thieves robbed hospitals and clinics of scarce pharmaceuticals and then sold them in front of the same places they robbed. The railway workers went out on strike and closed down the country's rail system. At this point, businesses and citizens across the country basically refused to take the local currency. Instead, everyone started dealing in German marks. Keep in mind the daily rate of inflation was nearly 100%. Can you imagine the panic in a society when the price of just about everything doubles every single day? It was absolute pandemonium, and the economy came to a grinding halt. It was like living in a war zone. Truckers stopped delivering goods. Stores, restaurants, gas stations all shut down. In fact, the only way to get gas was to buy it on the side of the road from someone selling it out of a plastic can. Steve Hanke, an economics professor at Johns Hopkins, wrote, "People couldn't afford to buy food in the free market. They kept from starving by either waiting in long lines at state stores for irregularly supplied rations of low-quality staples or by relying on relatives who lived in the countryside. For long periods, all of the gas stations were closed, with the exception of one station that catered to foreigners and embassy personnel. People also spent an inordinate amount of time at the foreign exchange black markets, where they traded huge piles of near-worthless money for a single German mark or U.S. dollar note. The number of operating buses dropped by 60%, and buses were so crowded that drivers couldn't even collect fares. Government-ordered blackouts left people without heat and electricity for long periods of time. In another ridiculous government move, they actually made it illegal not to accept a personal check. Imagine you could write a check, and in the several days that it typically takes for a check to clear, inflation would wipe out almost all of the cost of covering your check. Of course, as is typical, the government took none of the blame. As Dr. Thayer Watkins reported, the government's official position was that the hyperinflation occurred because of the unjustly implemented sanctions against the people and state. Again, I know what you're thinking. Just because it happened in Europe doesn't mean it can happen here. Well, guess what? The same thing that happened in this European country, Yugoslavia, also just happened in Iceland and Greece, but on a less dramatic scale. Of course, the only reason the situations in Greece and Iceland weren't worse is because of giant foreign bailouts. That's right. There's more debt to solve the problem of already existing insurmountable debts. It's all coming to a head soon, much sooner than people think. Remember, too, that in roughly the past 100 years, this type of debt crisis has reared its ugly head in Germany, Russia, Austria, Poland, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Poland, the Ukraine, Japan, and China. I believe it will soon happen right here in the United States. Don't believe me? Well, the truth is that it's already happening at the local and state levels. Take a look. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, a Washington, D.C. based think tank, at least 46 states face huge budget shortfalls for 2011, on top of the deficits they still haven't completely figured out for 2010. The center reports that the total state budget shortfall could reach $160 billion in 2011. And although many states got federal help over the past year, that aid is now gone. So, what are these desperate governments trying to do? You won't believe their proposals. The state of Arizona, for example, announced earlier this year that it is selling $735 million worth of government-owned buildings, but will still occupy them by paying a 20-year lease. The government is selling the legislative buildings, the House, the Senate, the state Capitol Executive Tower, the state fairgrounds, even prisons. In California, the state has taken the radical step of opening its prison doors and releasing thousands of inmates. About 11% of the state budget goes to the penal system. That's more than they spend on higher education. So California is slashing the number of inmates by 6,500 people next year. In other words, they're cutting loose about 4% of the prison population. Incredibly, other states, including New York, may do the same thing. In Georgia, the government is proposing taking out dead peasant policies on state employees. When these folks die, the money won't go to the dead person's family, but to the state's coffers to help pay for more programs, insurance, and pension liabilities. It's simply incredible, isn't it? State and municipal governments are so broke and so desperate that they are taking unprecedented steps to at least temporarily avoid bankruptcy. Nearly every state in the union is talking about legalizing some form of gambling to boost tax revenue. California still wants to legalize marijuana, even though it was defeated in the recent election. Of course, none of these ridiculous steps will work in the long run. And the truly amazing thing is that the U.S. federal government is in even worse shape than the local governments. The only reason we haven't seen the full brunt of this crisis yet on the federal level is because we've just continued to pile on more and more debt. The states can't print money, but the federal government can, at least for now. And for the moment, this is all that is preventing a currency collapse of unprecedented proportions. This is the important point. What most people don't realize is that the U.S. government can only continue printing dollars as long as the U.S. dollar remains the world's reserve currency. In other words, this is all going to fall apart much sooner than people think. In fact, it's already happening.